A lonely rancher named Ethan Cole never imagined that offering a single cup of water could pull him into the center of a moment that would change his life forever. When he found a tired, unusually tall Apache girl collapsing near his fence, he acted without thinking, lifting her to shade and giving her the water she desperately needed. She left with only a silent, heavy look in her eyes, but that look stayed with him long after the sun went down. Throughout the night he sensed movement in the hills, shadows shifting, whispers carried by the wind. By dawn the ground trembled under hundreds of hooves, and Ethan stepped outside with his heart pounding so hard he could hear it echo across the yard. Now, 300 Apache warriors surrounded his ranch, their faces unreadable, and he had no idea if his kindness had saved him or doomed him. Ethan Cole was a quiet rancher who preferred the sound of wind through dry grass over the noise of any crowded town, living so far from people that even passing riders were rare. His days were simple, steady, and calm until one burning afternoon shattered that calm forever. While checking his fences, he discovered an unusually tall Apache girl struggling to stand, her lips cracked from thirst and her breaths weak. Without hesitation, he helped her drink, guided her to shade, and tried to speak, but she slipped away before he could understand who she was or why she had come so far alone. That night, he felt the land around him grow strange, as if the desert itself held its breath, and distant drumbeats echoed across the dark hills. By sunrise, the earth shook beneath hundreds of hooves, and Ethan realized that helping that girl was only the beginning of something far more dangerous. Ethan stepped toward the silent water trough with a cautious breath, his boots stirring soft dust as the sun beat down on the ranch with an almost punishing heat, and he froze when he saw the tall Apache girl lying beside the wooden rail, her body trembling, her skin flushed from exhaustion and fear, her eyes barely open as she struggled to stay conscious. And for a long second he wondered if approaching her might spark panic. Yet something in her broken breaths pushed him forward until he knelt beside her and gently lifted her head so she could drink the cool water he poured with steady hands, watching her try to swallow while her voice cracked like dry earth under a heavy step. And as the water eased through her, a faint calm settled in her expression, though her strength remained fragile, and he guided her beneath a small patch of shade near the barn wall where the air felt softer, all while trying to speak without startling her, his words low and patient as he asked if she was hurt or lost, but she answered with only a quiet murmur he could not understand, her gaze drifting toward the distant hills as if something out there still weighed on her mind. And though her height and unique presence made her appear powerful, in that moment she seemed more like a frightened traveler who had carried too much for too long. So he stayed beside her, offering comfort through silence, because anything louder felt unkind to someone so close to collapse. And after a few minutes she slowly sat upright, her breath still uneven, but her posture growing steadier as she studied Ethan with an expression that mixed caution and gratitude. Then she pushed herself fully to her feet with surprising resolve, brushing dust from her dress while giving him a weak yet sincere smile that held far more meaning than any spoken thank you could have carried. And he sensed that she wanted to leave before questions forced her to share something she wasn't ready to reveal. So he didn't stop her when she turned toward the open land, her steps uneasy at first but determined as she moved farther from the ranch, glancing back once with eyes that lingered on Ethan, as if memorizing the man who had shown her unexpected kindness. And though he wished he could ask her why she had wandered so close to his home in such a fragile state, he remained silent, knowing the desert often carried mysteries that revealed themselves only when the time was right. So he watched her disappear beyond a stretch of tall grass where the wind twisted shadows into shapes that shifted like watching spirits, and an uneasy feeling tightened in his chest. Not fear exactly, but the sensation that her arrival had stirred something ancient in the land around him, something that did not rest easily inside the quiet boundaries of his ranch. So he stood there longer than he meant to, staring at the path she had taken, wondering if the moment would pass like a strange dream or if the desert would bring her or something connected to her back to him before the next sunrise. Asterisk. Ethan barely slept as the strange stillness pressed against the walls of his small cabin, and by the time the first pale stripe of dawn cut across the sky, he stepped outside with a heaviness in his chest that felt impossible to name. Yet everything around him seemed to demand his full attention, because the ground trembled beneath his feet, with a slow rhythm that did not belong to the wind or the restless desert, and his eyes searched the horizon for the source, until he caught sight of dust, rising far beyond the ridge, like a storm building with purpose. And as the trembling grew stronger, he felt the quiet morning shift into something charged with danger. Then the first figures emerged, dark and distant at first, but quickly sharpening into riders, moving with unity and precision. Their formation wide enough to swallow the open plain, and Ethan stood frozen as more shapes appeared behind them, multiplying until the entire ridge filled with what seemed like an unending line of Apache warriors riding toward his ranch with controlled intensity, their horses steady, their posture fierce, and their approach so deliberate that it felt as if the land itself bowed under their weight. Yet even as fear flickered inside him, he stepped forward, because turning back felt useless when the riders moved with such certainty. And soon the thundering sound of hooves surrounded him completely as hundreds circled his property in a tightening ring that locked him inside a living wall of dust and motion, while the air thickened with heat and the raw presence of warriors who carried a silent power that made every breath feel heavier. And Ethan kept his hands visible, hoping that calm would protect him if nothing else could, though his pulse hammered loud enough to drown the distant echoes still rolling across the hills. Then the circle slowed, shifting with practiced coordination, until the front line separated just enough for a single rider to emerge, a tall man with a stern expression marked by paint that framed his steady gaze, and Ethan felt the gaze cut through him with an intensity that made his spine stiffen. Yet he refused to step back, because retreat would only feed their suspicion, and the rider stopped several feet away, studying him with a silence so deep it felt like another presence in the morning air. And Ethan held his ground as more riders leaned forward slightly, not in aggression, but in focused awareness, as though waiting for a signal he could not understand. And with every second the tension tightened like a rope pulled from both ends, until Ethan realized they were not here for violence alone, but for judgment, something heavier and more personal, something directly tied to the girl he had helped. Yet before he could form a single word, movement stirred at the far side of the ring, and every warrior shifted as one, creating an opening. As someone began walking forward with slow, deliberate steps, and though Ethan couldn't yet see who it was, he felt the moment sharpen into something that would decide everything. Asterisk. Ethan's breath caught as the figure moved through the parted warriors with steady, echoing steps, each footfall quiet yet carrying a weight that made every rider straighten in perfect respect. And as the dust swirled away from the center of the ring, he finally saw her, the same tall Apache girl he had helped, now standing with a strength that looked completely different from the fragile state she'd been in the previous day, her posture firm, her expression calm, and her presence commanding enough to shift the entire atmosphere around the ranches. She approached without hesitation, her eyes fixed on Ethan with a look he couldn't read, and though relief flickered inside him for a moment, it was instantly swallowed by the pressure of hundreds of warriors watching his every move, their hands resting near their weapons, not raised but ready, their silence heavy enough to press against his chest like an unseen hand. And Ethan remained perfectly still. Asterisk. Knowing that a single wrong gesture could turn the morning into something no kindness could repair, while the girl stopped only a few steps from him, her gaze steady, her breathing even, and the warriors tightened their circle just slightly, making the ranch feel like a sealed world where fate had narrowed to a single point. Then she lifted her hand and touched the necklace hanging around her neck, a simple piece of carved stone that caught the light, and Ethan noticed the riders shift subtly at the movement, their focus sharpening as if the gesture meant far more than he understood. And she spoke one soft word in her language, a word he didn't recognize but felt through the tone, and the lead warrior stepped forward, his horse snorting as the man dismounted with graceful precision, his presence radiating authority that rolled over the silent ring like a slow wave. And he approached Ethan with a deliberate calm that carried as much threat as it did control, stopping close enough that Ethan could see every line carved into the man's face by years of responsibility, hardship, and battle. Yet the warrior did not reach for a weapon, instead letting the pause stretch long enough to measure the rancher's character through stillness. And Ethan held his gaze without defiance, but without shrinking either, knowing that fear had no place in a moment shaped by honor and judgment. And the girl stepped to the warrior's side, her expression now shadowed with emotion that flickered between gratitude and something deeper, something guarded, as she spoke again, in a quiet tone that made the leader's face shift slightly, not softening but changing with recognition, and though Ethan still couldn't understand the words, he felt the weight of the exchange settle over him like a verdict slowly forming in the space between breaths, and the leader lifted his hand toward the circle, prompting every rider to adjust in perfect unison, narrowing the ring until Ethan stood at the very center of their silent attention, realizing this was not a simple visit but a test that would reveal its meaning only when they decided he had earned the truth, or whatever fate waited in the tightening stillness around him. The leader's raised hand hovered in the air for a breath, before he lowered it slowly, and the entire circle of warriors shifted just enough to open a narrow path behind him, though none of their eyes left Ethan as the tall Apache girl stepped forward with a calm that contrasted sharply with the tension closing around the ranch, her stride steady, her expression filled with a quiet strength that made Ethan as a pool set thicken, and when she stopped directly in front of him, the entire formation seemed to lean into the moment, as if every rider understood that what happened next to decide whether the desert stayed peaceful or erupted into something far worse. Then she lifted her chin and met Ethan's gaze, with sincerity that looked carved from something deeper than gratitude. Her voice, soft but clear as she spoke words he couldn't understand yet felt through the emotion behind them, and the leader listened with stillness that vibrated through the circle like a signal only the warriors recognized, while her tone shifted gently, carrying a mix of vulnerability and truth that pulled Ethan's attention so completely he forgot the hundreds of riders surrounding him, and she touched the carved stone at her necklace again, this time sliding it forward enough for Ethan to see symbols etched into its surface with careful detail, her fingers trembling just slightly as if the memory tied to it still lived close to her heart. And she continued speaking to the leader with a steadiness that grew stronger each moment, her voice building with purpose until the man finally turned, his eyes from her to Ethan, the ghost of understanding settling across his features, not softening them but giving them a weight shaped by respect rather than suspicion. And Ethan stood motionless as the girl stepped closer, close enough that he could see the faint mark on her cheek where the desert sun had burned the day before, close enough to feel the sincerity in the way she breathed before turning toward the warriors and lifting her hand in a gesture filled with meaning. He could only guess it, prompting every rider to lower their weapons in a single synchronized movement that rolled around the ring like a slow wave of acceptance. And Ethan felt a quiet shock run through him as the pressure in the air eased, though the moment still carried an intensity that held his heart in a tight grip. For the girl shifted her stance and spoke directly to him in halting but heartfelt English, her words simple yet powerful as she explained that he had saved her when her strength had nearly failed, and that her people had come not to punish but to judge whether the man who helped her did so with honor or hidden motives. And she lowered her gaze briefly before raising it again with newfound certainty, telling him that she had stood before the leader and her entire tribe to declare that his kindness had been genuine, a truth she felt in the way he had protected her without asking for anything in return. And the leader stepped forward with solemn dignity, placing a firm hand on Ethan's shoulder in recognition of the girl's testimony, marking the moment as a turning point that shifted the entire gathering from threat to gratitude. Asterisk. The leader's hand remained on Ethan's shoulder for a long, silent moment before he stepped back with deliberate calm, and the circle of warriors adjusted their stance just slightly, no longer tense but still watchful, creating an atmosphere thick with expectation as Ethan tried to steady his breath while the girl moved to stand beside the leader with quiet dignity, her eyes reflecting a depth of emotion that made the world around them feel narrower, as if every sound and movement belonged only to this one moment. And the leader finally spoke, in his language, his voice low and steady, each word carrying the weight of authority that rippled through the warriors like a signal of caution mixed with respect, though Ethan could understand nothing except the tone, which felt like a test being shaped rather than ended. And when the leader stopped speaking, the girl stepped forward again, her steps careful, but sure as she stood close enough that Ethan could feel the fragile electricity of truth building between them. Then she took a slow breath and explained in soft, careful English that her people believed in seeing a man's heart, not through words, but through the choices he made when no reward waited. And because of that belief, the tribe had decided to watch him the night before, studying the way he guarded his home, the way he carried himself when he thought no one stood near, and the way he reacted to the signs of their presence. And Ethan felt a faint tension crawl up his spine as she continued, revealing that the shadows he sensed, the quiet breaths he felt behind the hills, and the strange silence hanging over the ranch had all been deliberate. A silent test of character carried out by warriors trained to move without leaving more than a whisper, and she spoke with a tenderness woven through her voice as she told him that everything he had done that night, from the way he stepped outside with caution instead of anger to the way he looked toward the unknown without fear or arrogance, had proven something about his spirit that mattered deeply to her people. And the leader nodded once, confirming her words with a solemn expression, as he approached again and lifted his hand toward Ethan's chest, pressing it lightly against the fabric near his heart in a symbolic gesture that sent every warrior lowering their gaze in unified acknowledgement. Then the leader stepped away, allowing a smaller group of riders to approach with a wooden bowl, filled with cool water, offering it to Ethan as a sign of trust, a gesture rarely shown to anyone outside their tribe. And as Ethan accepted it carefully, the warriors watched with unwavering seriousness, waiting for him to drink, which he did, with steady hands, feeling the water settle like a promise inside him. Then the girl stepped closer once more, her voice softening as she explained that the tribe had gathered not only to judge him but to decide whether he was worthy of a deeper bond of peace, protection, and respect, something offered only when a stranger showed the kind of honor her people valued more than strength. And Ethan felt the moment shift from fear to something profound as the desert air wrapped around them with a sense of history unfolding in quiet, powerful stillness. Asterisk. Ethan held the bowl for a moment longer, feeling the cool water settle inside him while the desert breeze moved gently across the silent circle. And as he lowered it, the leader stepped back with a slow nod that shifted the atmosphere from tense judgment to a deeper calm that settled through every rider, allowing the girl to take another quiet step toward Ethan, her presence steady yet filled with an emotion she no longer tried to hide. And she told him in soft English that the test had ended, that her people had seen the truth of his heart, and that no warrior there doubted the sincerity behind the kindness he had shown her when she had been weak, alone, and close to collapsing in the unforgiving heat. And Ethan felt a subtle weight lift from his chest as the riders relaxed their posture, though their unity and discipline stayed intact, creating a powerful sight that made the entire moment feel larger than anything he had ever imagined. And the girl continued speaking with a clarity shaped by gratitude and pride as she explained that the carved stone she wore was not merely a piece of decoration but a symbol passed through her family, carried by those trusted to walk between her tribe and the outside world, and by helping her when she had carried that responsibility alone and unprotected. Ethan had unknowingly stepped into a place of honor within her people, a place rarely offered to anyone beyond their own. Then the leader raised his hand once more, not in warning this time but in recognition, prompting a handful of riders to bring forward a small woven cloth containing gifts shaped from the land-smooth stones marked with symbols of peace, dried herbs used for healing, and a carved wooden figure representing guidance, all offered with solemn respect as the girl explained their meaning. And Ethan accepted each item with careful hands, feeling the significance settle inside him like another unspoken promise. And as the gifts were placed in his grasp, the circle of warriors slowly opened, creating a wide path that swept from the center of the ranch toward the open plain. A silent signal that the moment of judgment had passed and the time for departure had come. Yet the girl stayed where she stood, her expression softening with a warmth that tightened Ethan's breath. As she told him she would not forget his kindness, that the memory of his help would remain with her through every journey she would take, and that her people, from Tuesday forward, would watch the edges of his land with quiet protection, ensuring that danger never approached him unseen. Then she reached out and briefly touched his hand with a gentle sincerity that echoed more strongly than any ceremony. And without another word, she turned to join her people as the riders formed a new, fluid line, moving with practiced grace as the entire group began riding toward the horizon, their figures blending with the rising light until only drifting dust and faint hoofbeats remained, leaving Ethan standing alone in the quiet morning with the gifts pressed against his chest, realizing that one simple act of kindness had woven his life into a story far greater than the ranch he guarded, a story that would forever shape the way the land felt. Beneath his feet, as the last distant echo of hooves faded into the quiet plain, Ethan remained still, holding the small woven cloth against his chest as the morning light settled over the empty ranch. And in that silence he felt the truth of what had happened sink deep into his heart, shaping a memory he knew time would never wash away, because the girl's brief touch on his hand still warmed his skin, and the promise of unseen protection lingered in the air like a soft breath of wind, reminding him that the world was far wider and far more mysterious than he had ever allowed himself to believe. And as he looked toward the horizon where the riders had disappeared, he understood that kindness had carried him into a different kind of story, one built not from fear, but from courage, gratitude, and trust. And he whispered a quiet hope into the open sky that wherever she traveled next, she would carry the same strength and peace she had left behind in him. Asterisk.